We are going to be doing our project on Black Lives Matter and the criminal justice system.
Black Lives Matter is a social movement that stemmed from years of inequality that the Black community has faced. This movement has gained much attraction with the use of mobile recording devices. These horrific actions that police have committed on minority communities have been brought to light, which garnered a lot of attention. However, despite many agreeing there are disparities, there are many who fail to acknowledge this movement in turn, causing less support. The question we asked how Black Lives Matter can be better supported, whether through racial sensitivity training or reformation of the criminal justice system.
Historically, people of color have always been treated as lesser humans than white people in our society. While slavery is the most prominent example of that treatment, the inequality did not stop with the abolishment of it. Instead, the mistreatment moved into different aspects of society, one of those aspects being the criminal justice system. After slavery was abolished, farm owners still needed people to run their fields, so the government decided to arrest people of color for petty crimes and put them into work prison, basically sending them back into the life as a slave. Following this trend, the government then passed Jim Crow laws, which quite literally delegated Black Americans as second class citizens. Many of the policies in the United States justice system were designed specifically to oppress people of color. And as much as people say things have changed, many of those policies still exist today and are still creating disparities for people of color. For example, in the 1970s, we began an era that is defined by mass incarceration. This era is often referred to as war on drugs. During this era, federal spending for local law enforcement doubled, and the United States prison population jumped from around 300,000 to over 1.5 million. While attempting to get drugs off the street is a good thing, we decided to deal with drug addiction and dependency as a criminal issue rather than a health issue, which had harmful effects on the people of color communities. The Nixon presidency was the presidency that put this war on drugs in motion, and despite them saying it was solely to keep people safe and away from harmful drugs, they had alternative motives. In fact, a Nixon advisor was recorded stating, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 had two enemies, the anti war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." After this era of mass incarceration from drugs, policies were developed like mandatory minimums and the three strike rule. The three strike rule was a policy that made it so once someone gets their third felony, they are put in prison for life. This heavily affected people of color, as they were the ones being focused on the most for drug crimes. These policies created heavy racial disparities in our criminal justice system that are still prevalent today. The US has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. And while black men only make up 6.5% of the US population, they make up 40.2% of the US prison population. Even after people have served their time for their crime, it is incredibly hard to reintegrate back into society, and as felons, they lose many of their rights. The biggest right they lose is the right to vote. And because the prison population is so heavily black, policies that affect people of color continue to be passed and put in place because the people it affects cannot vote. Today, for example, nearly 30% of the Alabama black population has permanently lost the right to vote as a result of a criminal conviction.
Unconscious bias has grown in the criminal justice system for years. Knowing that discretion decision making from implicit bias judges, prosecutors, and police officers can lead to innocent minorities to be incarcerated. For example, researchers from Notre Dame Law mentioned black defendants far worse in court than their white counterparts. Hence, understanding how explicit bias and implicit bias cause racial disparities in the court, and it will create a better understanding of mass incarceration in America. Racial disparities has narrowed over the years, but it still remains a huge difference between black and white incarceration. In 1954, there were 100,000 black men in American prisons. Today, one-third of African American men can expect to go to jail. We ask ourselves why Black men in America are discriminated against and why are most of them in prison? The reason being, Black males are viewed as criminals or a threat. This causes judges to hold implicit racial bias against Black men. Biases can influence their judgment, and that can automatically put Black men at disadvantages.
Our police force is supposed to be our symbol of justice to serve and protect the public population, but throughout the years, they have been seen as oppressors by the public eye due to injustices they have committed. To help fix this stigma, they need proper training for racial bias and de-escalation. But there is no standard police training for all of the U.S. It is controlled by each department separately. From articles that I've read, the average number I have seen for racial sensitivity training is 2 hours per year, or sometimes up to 3 to 5 years, only getting 2 hours of training. In 36 different states, a trainee can act as a police officer for over 12 months before receiving proper training to be able to properly act in the field. They have the ability to detain and arrest and shoot even before they've been received any form of training.
Today, there are more African American adults under correctional control than were enslaved in the 1850s before the Civil War. The explosion in the size of our prison population over the last 40 years rakes in billions of dollars a year for the CCA and other for-profit prison companies. The United States has built up the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world, with over 2.3 million men and women living behind bars. This is a historical anomaly. Despite relatively stable incarceration rates earlier in the 20th century, our prison population grew by 700% between 1970 and 2005, far outpacing both crime and general population growth. And this over-incarceration epidemic has a massive and disproportionate impact on people of color. If trends continue, 1 in 3 Black men born today can expect to serve time behind bars. Not only has our amount of prisoners grew in size, but increasingly the privatization of prisons has endorsed a market where police departments are not only encouraged, but incentivized to send people to jail. Typically, these people who are sent to jail come from Black and brown communities, and for the most part, they are given public defenders who are oftentimes overworked, which causes those accused to take plea deals admitting guilt. This has created a modern phenomenon known as the prison industrial complex. Despite how advanced we say our country is, we have ties to racist and utterly disruptive practices. These policies are still present to this day, and despite the recent change of opinion on drugs such as marijuana, many of those caught for drugs are placed in these federal prison systems and left in the shadows. American justice system focuses itself too much on the punitive side of the law.
In the year of 2020, at least 33 Black transgender people were fatally shot or killed by other violent means. The mortality rate in 2020 were more than 2017 alone. You might not have heard of the Instagram sensation Jaslyn Boston, but you will hear about her now. She's a Black trans woman who was assaulted by a male who offered to buy her something out of a gas station. But when he figured she was a trans woman, he got violent with her and hit her with a metal plate beside her head. Then a few minutes after, he made derogatory remarks towards her. There have been several hate crimes in America for years because of gender identity. The sad part about it is because the women that are being targeted are Black. Transgender people feel unsafe and Blacks feel threatened because some deaths are being unreported. How can we call for help when people who are supposed to protect us doesn't even care? There have been cases when police officers has been racially biased towards Black trans women, causing them to misreport incidents that happen to trans women in America. Ask yourself, if these were white trans women dying from hate crimes, will we know about it or would it remain unreported also? You might not have heard of Breonna Hill also. She is a Black trans woman who was slammed to the ground by two Kansas City officers. The police officer had stated that Hill was involved in a dispute in a beauty supply store, and it caused the owner to call the police so she can be removed. Later, the police officers mentioned she resisted arrest and was taken to the ground. Spectators at the time witnessed the police officers brutally slam her head to the concrete.
Removing health disparities from society can play a large role in the betterment of the Black Lives Matter movement and the criminal justice system. This can be done by allowing for a more efficient access to care, which can include insurance coverage and medical finances, a better quality of care that may include taking away low budget healthcare establishments in low income neighborhoods, and lastly, allowing for lifestyle changes and improvements within the Black communities and the criminal justice systems. This can include allowing for improved access to healthy food options and safe environment for exercising.
As mentioned before, our criminal justice system focuses on the punitive side of law. This approach is very different from how the rest of the world tackles this problem. Rather than using punishment as a deterrent, we should seek to rehabilitate criminals and ultimately reintroduce them back into society. This ideal seems to be lost in our current system, and due to that, a movement has been gaining momentum within the last decade known as restorative justice. This system places more emphasis on communities and seeks to bring back empathy within the justice system. This includes abolishing the idea of mandatory minimum sentences, which has grown so prevalent. Rather, community leaders and those affected are to decide what happens as punishment for the offender. This, compounded with reducing or ultimately forgiving those of nonviolent victimless felonies, will prove to lower the prison population